Halloween, typically a time where we celebrate all things creepy and indulge ourselves in a few scares, safe in the knowledge that the antics we get up to are all just fun and games. But that's not always the case. There's been an abundance of horrifying incidents that have taken place on All Hallows Eve, and be they accidents or murders, they are all disturbing reminders that amongst all the fake blood and latex masks, real horror doesn't take a night off. Number 1. On Halloween night, 1974, 8-year-old Timothy O'Brien went trick-or-treating with his sister, Elizabeth, and 2 other children in Pasadena, accompanied by Timothy's father, Ronald, and another parent. The night started off innocently enough, but would go on to end in tragedy. When the group knocked on one particular door, there was seemingly no one home, and as such, they swiftly moved on. Timothy's father stayed behind for a moment to wait and see if anybody would answer the door. He quickly caught back up with the others, with 5 pixie sticks in his hand, given to him by the homeowner who was simply taking their time to answer the door. He distributed the candy amongst the children, and later gave the spare one to a child who was not with the group. It began to rain, and as such, they cut their trick-or-treating session short, and the children and their parents went back to their homes. Before bed, Timothy asked his parents if he could dip into his candy collection. They agreed, and young Timothy decided to start with the pixie stick. He poured some of the powdery candy into his mouth, but immediately complained that it tasted unusually bitter. Timothy quickly realized that something was wrong, and he rushed to the bathroom with severe stomach pains. Shortly after, Timothy began to convulse, and within no time at all, went limp in his father's arms. He died as he was being rushed to the hospital. After a pathology report, it was revealed that the pixie sticks had been laced with a poison, a fatal dose of potassium cyanide to be precise. Timothy consumed enough poison to have killed 2 adults. Thankfully, none of the other children in the group had eaten their pixie sticks, though theirs also tested positive for containing lethal amounts of cyanide. The tops of the candy wrappers had been opened, filled with poison, and resealed with a stapler. After the news of Timothy's death spread, there was community uproar, with parents from the surrounding area returning their children's Halloween candy to the police, fearing that a maniac had been handing out poisoned treats to as many trick-or-treaters as possible, with the sole intention of killing dozens of children. And that's exactly what was believed to have happened by the police, initially, at least. The authorities began to grow suspicious of Ronald, Timothy's own father, due to his inability to even recall which house handed out the pixie sticks, despite the fact that he and the children had only visited a handful of houses across 2 streets that evening. Even more strange was the fact that none of the houses that the group had visited that evening had been handing out pixie sticks to trick-or-treaters. Eventually, the truth came to light. Ronald had poisoned the candy himself, and ensured that it ended up being given to all of the children that he had taken out trick-or-treating. His motivation? To collect on various life insurance policies that he had taken out on his son, and presumably his daughter, though, as stated, she never ate her candy. He gave the other children the sweets in order to cover his tracks, and make it appear as if someone else was indiscriminately handing out the poisoned pixie sticks. Turns out that Ronald was over $100,000 in debt, and the life insurance payouts that he was set to receive would have eased his financial woes. Throughout his entire trial, Ronald maintained his innocence, but the amount of evidence pointing towards him as the murderer was too substantial for the jury to ignore. It was revealed that Ronald had been talking to chemists about where he could purchase cyanide and how much would be needed for a lethal dosage. His friends and co-workers also testified that Ronald showed an unusual interest in the poison in the months leading up to Halloween. He was found guilty of murder and 4 counts of attempted murder, and was sentenced to death. While incarcerated, he was despised by his fellow inmates, who condemned him for murdering his own son. Ronald's execution took place on March 31st, 1984, just after midnight. A crowd of demonstrators gathered outside as he died, some even chanting, "Trick or treat." For his heinous crime, Ronald has become known as the man who killed Halloween. Number 2. Paranoia can be a hell of a thing. In some cases, it can lead a person to commit some truly abhorrent crimes. Halloween night 2004 was much like any other for Adrienne Insogna, Leslie Ann Mazzara, and Lauren Meanza, who all lived together in the extremely safe Californian city of Napa, which hadn't seen a murder in 2 years. The evening was a mostly quiet affair, with the roommates handing out sweets to young trick-or-treaters as they came to the door. With Napa being far from a city with a vibrant nightlife, the trio decided to go to bed early. In the early hours of the morning, Lauren was awoken by a motion sensor light going off and illuminating her room. This was accompanied by her dog giving off what she would later realize was a warning bark. She thought little of it, since her roommate's cat would often set the light off. This proved not to be the case, when Lauren then heard somebody enter the house and creep up the stairs. She rationalized that this was most likely Leslie's boyfriend, who had recently started making a habit of coming over to the house to stay the night. The next sounds that Lauren would hear would be horrific screams coming from Adrienne's bedroom. She recalls hearing her friend calling for help and begging for her life. As Lauren left her room, the sounds of the intruder rampaging throughout the house chilled her to the core, and in a state of confusion, she fled into the back garden to hide. As she laid low, she then heard Leslie screaming for help. Lauren went back into the house to call 911 and was met with a gruesome discovery. Leslie lay dead in her room, and Adrienne, though still conscious, was rapidly bleeding out and unable to talk. They had both been stabbed repeatedly. Despite attempts to save her life, Adrienne also perished. Their killer remained at large for almost a year, before he was eventually pinned to the crime, based upon cigarette butts that were found outside the girls' shared house. He was named as Eric Koppel, the fiancé of one of Adrienne's friends, Lily. He'd become jealous of the friendship that Adrienne had with his future wife, and became violently paranoid that she was somehow a threat to his marriage. Prior to being identified as the murderer, Eric was thought of by Lauren to be a nice, shy guy. He even attended the candlelight vigils of his 2 victims, the other mourners completely oblivious that he was their killer. Lauren was able to escape that night with her life, and has been quoted as saying, "Still, I can't sleep. Basically, it was a horror movie. That's what I thought when I was up there." Number 3. The Liske family murder was a horrific incident that took place in Port Clinton, Ohio, on Halloween night 2010. William and Susan Liske were a happily married couple and lived with Susan's 2 children, Derek and Devon Griffin. Since Halloween fell on a Sunday that year, Devon spent the evening at church, a decision that most likely saved his life. When the 16-year-old returned home, he was met with what can best be described as most of our worst nightmares. His stepfather, mother, and brother were strewn across the home, their corpses a bloody mess. Devon thought this was an elaborate and tasteless Halloween joke, and that his family was simply playing dead, In reality, they had all been brutally bludgeoned to death by William's son, William Liske Jr. When Devon realized that his family had been violently killed, he swiftly called his aunt in a panic, who in turn phoned 911, stating, "My nephew came home, and there's blood everywhere." The young William Liske Jr. had a history of arrests, and had stopped taking his medication for mental illness. He lived in a halfway house close to the family home. His instability and schizophrenia are believed to be the reason that he beat his father and stepfamily to death. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Number 4. In October 1992, Japanese exchange student Yoshihiro Hattori was on his way to a Halloween party with his homestay brother, Webb Haymaker. The pair were costumed and excited for the promising night ahead. The only problem was that neither of the two knew exactly which house the party was being held at. As they came to the right neighborhood in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, they noticed a house with an abundance of Halloween decorations outside, and assumed that was their destination. They approached the house and they knocked on the door. There was no response, but the owners were home. Bonnie Pierres had noticed that the two boys were outside of their house, and for reasons unknown was so startled that she yelled for her husband to get his gun. This went unnoticed by the two boys outside, however, who realized they must have gone to the wrong house for the party. Soon afterwards, Bonnie's husband, Rodney, emerged from the house with a .44 Magnum. As the two boys walked away from the house, oblivious to Rodney's presence, he shouted, "Freeze!" Yoshi, still learning English after having spent only 2 months in the US, misinterpreted Rodney's command. He turned around and walked back towards the armed homeowner. This prompted Rodney to shoot Yoshi through the chest at almost point-blank range. After this, he immediately ran back into his house and locked the door. Webb ran to a neighboring house for help. As the neighbor came out and called 911, Bonnie Pierres is said to have shouted, "Go away," from inside her house. By the time that help arrived, it was far too late. The bullet had pierced the young Japanese student's left lung, and he died as he was being rushed to the hospital. He was only 16 years old. It would be 40 minutes after the fatal shooting that the police would arrive at the scene. By invoking a castle doctrine defense, Rodney was cleared of manslaughter charges, arguing that he had the right to use lethal force to protect his property. Yoshi's family was awarded $650,000 in damages, though they would only ever receive $100,000 of that amount for their son's life. Yoshi's death prompted millions to petition for stronger gun control laws. His father, Masaichi, is tragically quoted as saying, "Sometimes I feel like he's still in America. Someday he'll come back home, I say to myself." Number 5. On the night of October 31st, 1993, a group of young teenagers were walking home from a Halloween party in Bungalow Heaven, Pasadena. The boys, unusually tall for their age, were wearing masks and bandanas, innocent enough on a Halloween evening, though by masking their identities, the boys had inadvertently put themselves in mortal danger. As they walked back home, they were suddenly shot at by a group of men hidden nearby who had planned to ambush the group. The young boys had become the victims of a revenge shooting by gang members who mistook them for a group of their rivals that had murdered one of their crew earlier that day. They waited for the youngsters to pass by and then unleashed a hail of bullets into them, covering the pavement in trick-or-treat candy and blood. They then immediately fled the scene, laughing and flashing gang signs. Of the 6 boys who were shot, 3 were killed: Edgar Evans, Stephen Coates, and Reggie Crawford. They were all between the ages of 13 and 14. Pasadena gang members Carl Holmes, Lorenzo Alex Newborn, and Herbert Charles McLean Jr. were found guilty of gunning down the group after having mistaken them for their rival gang. Throughout the entire trial, the gang members insulted the jury, judge, and even threatened to murder the bailiffs. They laughed about their actions and showed no signs of any remorse. As a result of their crime, and the way they reveled in the murder of the 3 innocent teenage boys, the judge found no difficulty in sentencing the men to death. The cruelty and callousness and sophistication is sufficient aggravation to warrant death, said the judge. Carl Holmes and his fellow gang members intentionally extinguished the budding lives of 3 young men of great promise, then drove away, giving a thumbs up sign, bragging of their deeds. Hi guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. Be sure to subscribe and join the Lazy Legion for more spooky content to complement the run-up to Halloween. Also, be sure to check out Anthony's artwork by following the links in the description below. Stay safe this October, and remember, the best things happen in the dark.